Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to our first talk by Professor Keila Grinberg, who is Andrés Bello Chair in Latin American Culture and Civilization here at the King Juan Carlos Center. Professor Grinberg is an Associate Professor of History at the Universidade Federal do Estado de Rio de Janeiro and a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. She's one of the foremost authorities on the history of slavery, freedom, and slavery and the law in Brazil and the Atlantic world. She is the author or co-author or editor of 10 books and dozens of articles published in Portuguese, English, Spanish, and French. She is a foremost authority on the history of slavery, emancipation, and slavery and the law in Brazil and the Atlantic world. Among her books are O Fiador dos Brasileiros, is that right? Yes. And Antonio Pereira Rebosas, and which is being translated as we speak by University of North Carolina Press. She's the editor with Sue Peabody of the volume entitled Free Soil in the Atlantic World, as well as another on slavery and the law in the Atlantic world. She is currently at work on a new project which examines 19th century cases of kidnapping and illegal enslavement on the southern Brazilian border and their larger effects on the making of South American international relations. With Ebe Matos and Marta Abreu, she is currently directing the public digital history project entitled Pasts, Presents, Memories of Slavery in Brazil. And she'll be speaking tonight on the project on illegal enslavement. The title of her talk is Slavery, Illegal Enslavement, and International Conflicts in 19th Century South America. So welcome, Professor Grinberg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ada, for your kind words. I also would like to say that it's been an honor and also a huge source of happiness for me to be here. I want to thank Laura Turegano, who is making my life very easy and wonderful here too, and also Barbara Weinstein, who I'll never be able to thank enough for everything, but I'll keep repeating. I'm in the process of finishing a book about the illegal enslavement in the borders between Brazil and Uruguay, and that's the main topic of my talk today. So I will very much appreciate your thoughts, your comments, your criticisms, disagreements, and so on. So, but first I will start by saying how I came to study this. Many years ago, when I was studying the freedom lawsuits, which are the lawsuits in which so-called slaves would sue their so-called masters, arguing for that they had the right to be freed, I came across a very different type of lawsuits, which are the ones that I called later the free soil lawsuits, in which some enslaved individuals that would cross the border to Uruguay and Argentina would return to Brazil and then claim freedom based on the fact that they had stepped on free soil after the abolition of slavery in either Uruguay and Argentina in the 1840s or the 1850s. So they claimed that they could not be held as slaves in Brazil because of the abolition of slavery, but also because of the law that forbade enslavement in Brazil, and re-enslavement in Brazil, and also the law that prohibited the slave trade in 1831. So those cases happened in the late 1860s. This is just a random example of them. 1867, 68, 69, and all with the same lawyer, and all made their way into the Court of Appeals of Rio. There are not that many. There are just 5 or 6 of them. So while I was reading them, I thought that this was just a smart legal use of the law in which they were trying, some lawyer came up with that idea to put those laws together and trying to claim freedom for those individuals, but never more than that. But sometimes those things stay in your mind. So once I was in a bus crossing the border between Argentina and Brazil, coming from Santiago, at the time that we would do this by bus. So it's a long time ago. And then we were about to cross the border, to cross the Uruguayan River into the Brazilian town of Uruguaiana. And then we passed a town called Paso de los Libres. So I immediately thought, Paso de los Libres, the passage of the freed or freed. So maybe my cases, the cases I knew, were not so few cases. Maybe this was a huge movement. Maybe this was like the Underground Railroad, that the slaves would pass through this border and get freed. Totally wrong. Couldn't be more wrong. Paso de los Libres refer to another episode when the Libertadores from Argentina crossed the river much before that in one of the conflicts between Rivera, Argentinian leader, and the Brazilians. Had nothing to do with those cases. But the interesting thing for me is that after I saw that, when I was crossing the border myself, I really started to think more seriously about that and think that maybe there was more than that, than just a smart legal use of an argument. So then I started looking for more documents. I went to Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil. I went to Montevideo in Uruguay. I went to Buenos Aires, to London, back to Rio, and I never stopped finding documents. I still didn't find. I just stopped because I have to stop. But I found lawsuits, consuls' reports, police reports, newspaper articles, wills, letters, a huge amount of documents that would deal with the passage of enslaved people in the borders between mostly Brazil and Uruguay, but also Brazil and Argentina along the whole 19th century. And of course, while I was doing that, I was also reading and getting inspiration from the historiography on the transnational movement of enslaved people in the Caribbean, and also reading about, of course, the Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Acts and the U.S. Civil War. And it's interesting because even though those cases were pretty compelling about the existence of enslaved people in the borders and how they were trying to act to get freedom, I couldn't even, I think that those cases were really important in terms of the international affairs. And they didn't seem to have affected the borders, the politics between those countries. But then, I was, after thinking about that, when you look at the United States case and the Fugitive Acts and the border crossing and how this was considered, is this considered one of the causes of the war, especially when you look at the most famous lawsuit, the Dred Scott case, in which Dred Scott couldn't get freedom based on exactly the same argument that he stepped in free soil so he could be freed. The legal argument is, the ways in which it was denied is different, but his argument was the same, became really an important political point for political discussion in the pre-Civil War. So thinking about that and thinking about the Dred Scott impact in the Civil War, that image is interesting because it's not Dred Scott, but it comes very often when people are talking about the Dred Scott case, they use that image. This image is from another book wrote by former slave Henry Bibb. He crossed the Ohio River in 1837 into Indiana, and then he made his way to Canada. And this image is from his book, Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American slave. And for me, it's the best image of, that, of that legal argument. But anyway, I just want to highlight that reading about slavery and the common explanations about the Civil War in the US, I caught again myself thinking, if not just slavery, but the crossing of enslaved individuals over the state borders in the US had such an enormous impact, how come that the passage of enslaved people over the international borders of Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and not even in mentioning Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, didn't have any impact in the Paraguayan War, a conflict that was as important as the Civil War, at least in the ways we need to normally understand it. So with that question in mind, on top of all those documents, I started reading accounts about the war, about the Paraguayan War. So the Paraguayan War was the biggest and bloodiest conflict in the history of South America, lasting for almost 6 years, from 1864 to 1870. It ended with hundreds, thousands of deaths, a destroyed country of Paraguay, and maybe, and this is a hypothesis too, but the beginning of the end of the Brazilian Empire. We don't refer to the Paraguayan War in these terms, but now, running the risk of being counterfactual, we could also say that the Brazilian impact is like the Vietnam War for the US, that they won the war, but they lost at the end. So the war was officially won by the Triple Alliance, an alliance of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. But at least in Brazil, the Paraguayan War was a huge source of controversy. The 20 years after the end of the war, the Brazilian Empire was over by a military coup, led by some of the ones who fought the war and came back very resentful that it never received enough credit for that. But I want to focus on the causes, not on the consequences of the war. Since its end, the causes have been subject of discussion by contemporary politicians and then historians that would say that Solano Lopez, the president of Paraguay, was first a hero, then a tyrant, or that he would fight against British imperialism, or they would defend their borders. But over more than 100 years, we've been facing different historiographical interpretations. Nowadays, it's pretty common for historians to agree that we should understand the War of Paraguay, the Paraguayan War, in the process of nation building in the La Plata River area. And that means the definition of the borders, navigation rights over the rivers, conflicts over the competition of production of erva mate, Paraguayan access to the La Plata River, and contraband of cattle in the borders of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina mainly. I'm not going to contradict that main explanation, but I would like to add slavery as one of them. And slavery has been part of the historiography of the war as an internal Brazilian discussion, that the slaves that would join the army would get freedom, that the ones who would return to either Rio or Bahia or Pernambuco would not accept to go back to the old role that they had, that the fact that they joined the army was never, and they became heroes, was never really recognized. And there was racial discrimination and all that. But slavery has never been addressed as something that could have impacted the beginning of the war. And that's what I want to claim. I want to argue that in order to fully understand the beginning of the war, we have to address the tensions over slavery in the specific borders between Brazil and Uruguay. Given that all those countries, Uruguay, Argentina, but also the others, Spanish American countries have had slavery at some extent, and Brazil still had until 1888. Their positions regarding slavery and its abolition was an important part of the process of state building at this time. So I'm not wanting to contradict the idea of state building, but I want to say that when we say state building, we also should consider slavery as a part of it. So to do that, to include slavery, I think we should just do one thing: change the official date taken as the beginning of the war. When the war started, the Paraguayan War started in December 13th, 1864, when Paraguay officially declared war against Brazil and invaded the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. One day after attacking the slave ship Marquês de Olinda in Assunção that was crossing Paraguayan territory to reach Mato Grosso. It's important to say that at this time, this was the only or the easiest way for Brazilians from Rio de Janeiro to reach Mato Grosso. There were no roads, and there's no way to pass this territory, but they would go across the La Plata River, then the Paraná River, then that becomes Paraguayan River, all the way to Mato Grosso. So why Paraguay invaded Brazil? There were disputes over the borders again, but we can't understand why Paraguay invaded Brazil if we don't look at the reasons why. 2 months earlier, in October 16 of 1864, Brazil invaded Uruguay. When you look at the official chronology of the war, Brazilian invasion to Uruguay is considered either a pre-war or a military intervention that has nothing to do with the huge conflict that followed. Disagreeing with that explanation, of course, I think we should look at this episode as Brazilian politician Joaquim Nabuco referred to. From the Uruguayan War comes the Paraguayan War, and from that, the Triple Alliance War. So why Brazil invaded Uruguay? The official answer, found in every book I read, the good ones, the bad ones, is that because Uruguay didn't comply with the complaints made by the Brazilians who lived in the borders in the past 12 years. All the books say that. In May 1864, the Brazilian government had sent the liberal politician José Antônio Saraiva in a peace mission because escorted by 5 warships that were parked in front at the entrance of the La Plata River, and also by army troops that were located in Jaguarão at the border with Uruguay. But Saraiva was sent in this peace mission to deliver an ultimatum to the Uruguayan president, saying that he would have 6 days to say that he was going to agree with the Brazilian complaints. If not, the peace mission will end in Brazilian invasion in Uruguay. Last Uruguayan answer was quick and very funny. They said that, I mean, funny nowadays. They said that they were not going to accept those complaints, and they were returning the ultimatum to Saraiva, saying that this was so unacceptable that it couldn't even be filed in the Uruguayan archives. But they are. That was, it's written in the answer. So Uruguayan answer was quick. They were not going to accept those complaints. After that, Saraiva left the city of Montevideo, and less than 3 months later, Brazil invaded the north of Uruguay. Brazilian attitude at this point was very important to the deposition of Uruguayan President Aguirre, which was a member of the Blanco Party, and I will go back to that. And in his place, the General Venancio Flores from the Colorado Party, a long-time ally to the Brazilian landowners, became the new president. This is just important because when we understand the alliance between Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, we really need to take into account that it's between Brazil, Argentina, both supporters of the Colorado Party, and the Colorado Uruguayans. The Blancos in Uruguay were allies of Paraguay, and that's why after that Paraguay invaded Brazil for many reasons, but also in support of the Blancos. Um, just a little thing. I'm not going into much detail about that, and especially not about Argentinian involvement, even though it's very important, but it's just not to complicate even more that politics. So when we look at the Brazilian invasion in Uruguay, what most people would say is that it happened because Saraiva wasn't able to negotiate and because Uruguay didn't comply with Brazilian complaints. But then, what those complaints were about, why they were so important that they would cause the invasion of Uruguayan territory by Brazilians, why no one is paying attention, no one was paying attention to those complaints, and why till now there's literally not much, maybe a couple of articles written about that. So we'll try to understand. I mean, in order to answer that, I will go a little bit back in time and to the political borders of the La Plata River area when they were being disputed by both Portugal and Spain. And we're not going through all that, but just to say that during the last part of the 18th century, early part of 19th century, Montevideo and the rest of the territory that would become the Uruguay was Spanish, then Portuguese, then Spanish, then Portuguese. And when Brazil became independent in 1822, Uruguay was called the Província Cisplatina, the Portuguese Província Cisplatina, who was part of the Brazilian Empire. So that's really interesting because when Uruguay became independent after a 3-year war against Brazil, it became the only country in Spanish America that actually became independent from another South American country, which was Brazil. So this whole process, of course, the nation-building process in South America implies on many divisions, but this was the only one really fighting against Brazil as being the imperial country. And as everywhere else in the Americas, colonization also brought slavery. So in the La Plata River area, from the late 18th century on, there were big demands for laborers, big demands for slave labor, which meant that in Rio Grande do Sul at this time, pretty much 30% of the population was composed by slaves, and more Africans were being brought exactly to this area of the borders. There are some evidences that, at least in the 16th century, since the late 18th century on, the enslaved people would cross the borders between the Portuguese and the Spanish in both directions. And at this time, which I find really interesting, fugitive slaves who entered the Spanish territory would officially be considered free. And the legal word used then, it's something that we would recognize nowadays, is that they would be entering a freedom sanctuary. And maybe it's not a coincidence that now we have the same word being used in churches about the idea of a freedom sanctuary. Maybe there is a common legislation about refugees that was built back in it's before 16th century actually. Anyway, when slaves were crossing the borders, the Portuguese started to complain as early as the 1810s. They were really worried that the transit of slaves over the borders would become a bigger movement, and they did. And in the years 1810s and 20s, the slave trade would be prohibited in Rio de la Plata, in the 1830s in Brazil, but enslaved Africans would continue to be illegally brought to this area. Most of them would work in the ranches in the borders, and all of them, followed by their masters or not, with cattle or not, they would cross the borders doing their everyday lives because the properties would cross the borders too. So what happened here that made the difference? It's not the border crossing. There are two main differences here. First, a turmoil in Rio Grande do Sul, which was a separatist movement called Farroupilha, in Revolução Farroupilha, the Farroupilha movement, when they tried to separate, to create an independent republic from the rest of the empire, and many Brazilian slave owners, landowners, and cattle owners crossed the borders to keep their property away from the conflict. So they were based in Uruguay, and they started to own more and more property in the northern part of Uruguay. And the second thing, and really important thing, is the abolition of slavery in Uruguay in the context of a civil war that divided Blancos and Colorados. So here we are, 1835 to 45, a political movement in Brazil that made many Brazilians to cross the borders with Uruguay and occupy the north of the country, in a point that I don't know exactly the numbers, but it seems that the northern Uruguay was pretty much, the land was pretty much owned by Brazilians. And some years later, a civil war between Blancos and Colorados that would again divide the country, but also divide their positions over slavery. While all that happening, people were still crossing the borders. So the abolition of slavery in Uruguay, in the concept of the war, should really be understood as two measures. First, from the Colorados in 1842, and then from the Blancos in 1846, as a way for them to really try to get people to be part of their armies. So we're not talking about humanitarian reasons. We're not talking even about a strong abolitionist movement. Even though the humanitarian language was there and the rhetoric of freedom was there too, they were really trying to get people to be part of their troops. And we know that also because the Brazilian Republic of the Farroupilhas also abolished slavery, and abolished slavery in order to get people to work, to be part of the army. But the thing is that when Uruguayan slavery was abolished, the Brazilians that had property in Uruguay lost their property. And even though, and we are now in 1846, 47, even though they were promised to be reimbursed for their property, no one has ever paid for anything. So still in the context of the war, in 1847, 48, 49, Brazilians started to file official complaints saying that they lost property and this property needs to be reimbursed. Uruguay would even deny that they were part of the army, that they really became part of the army, because they said it's abolition of slavery. They became, whoever was here became an Uruguayan citizen, and now as Uruguayan citizens, they are protected by the Uruguayan government. For the Brazilian slave owners, this was a clear way for them not just to recruit, but to try to get more people to cross the borders and join the army, which was true. So in 1850, there were 900 individuals officially claimed as fugitives, but I believe there were much more. Probably not all of them in the army, but most living in the black communities that were formed in the borders, of course, in the Uruguayan side. But what happens next is that in 1851, with decisive Brazilian financial help, the Colorados won the Civil War over the Blancos. And Brazil charged very well for their help. In 5 treaties, they really set up control over Uruguay. And the last treaty, which was considered Lamas, who was the Uruguayan representative in Rio, after that, he was considered a traitor in Uruguay, and for a long time couldn't return to Montevideo, was the Treaty of Extradition of Slaves. So that's something really interesting, because it says that Brazilians could cross the borders to try to find their slaves, but if slavery is abolished in Uruguay, they were not slaves anymore. So how could Brazil really get a person, try to get a person back if that person was not a slave anymore? The treaty set this up, but even though there were many, many official complaints, not a single person was ever returned. So then the Brazilians started to act in their own, with their own means. And that movement was called, in Uruguay, they were calling this the Californias, which was the invasions of the Uruguayan territory by Brazilian caudillos that would try to get as many people and as many cattle as they could and cross the border back. Those movements were actually pre-organized, much more than I thought, with some landowners getting together and organizing their own army to invade the Uruguayan territory and attack the black communities over the borders. That came up. Oh, just a little thing. Brazil tried to sign the extradition, the Treaty of Extradition with other countries, with Argentina, but the Argentinians never really signed the treaty, but also with Peru, with Venezuela, with Colombia, with Bolivia, even with Ecuador. And Brazil doesn't have any direct borders with Ecuador, which means that at this time, they were really trying to defend slavery. They were really trying to defend their right to have slaves. I'm going back to that, we are in the early 1850s. So it was an Brazil was explicitly defending something that I think we can call slave territoriality in South America, whereas the other countries, and especially Uruguay, became a defender of a free soil territory. And that language, that political language, also became extremely important. In the specific case of Uruguay, because of the strength of the Brazilian presence, abolition of slavery, or freedom, became an important element of the political discourse, helping for them to define their national sovereignty, because national sovereignty was against Brazilian imperialism, was against Brazilian slavery in all senses. So freedom meant, in that case, exactly what we have seen in many other cases of independence, but here very close, the meaning: freedom from illegal enslavement, freedom of Brazilian presence in the Uruguayan politics. Those three, there is an episode in 1861, those people putting fire, burning those treaties in the main square of Montevideo, and was this huge happening when they would explicitly say how much they disliked the Brazilian presence, especially in the north. So what was the position of the Brazilian authorities over all that? Even though the governor of Rio Grande do Sul was always supportive of the slave owners, the Brazilian government in Rio couldn't be. And here is we have two other contextual pieces to understand this puzzle. First, since the early 1840s, the Brazilian diplomatic position in Uruguay was to defend Uruguayan independence. Because what was the other option? The other option was the creation of the Provincias Unidas del Rio de la Plata, when Uruguay and Argentina would become one country having both sides of Rio de la Plata, of the entrance of the La Plata River. And they didn't want that. So they defended Uruguayan independence, but so they have to agree to the recognition of Uruguayan abolition of slavery. The other piece of that puzzle is that Brazil had just been forced by the British to abolish for the second time the slave trade, African slave trade. The first law that prohibited slave trade, issued in 1831, was nearly ineffective after 5 or 6 years. And we know now that about 700,000 enslaved Africans were illegally brought to the country in the 1830s and 1840s. So in 1850, after being threatened to invade Rio de Janeiro, after the British threatened Rio, the Brazilian government had to prove to the British that they were respecting the anti-slave trade laws. So in order to do that, they couldn't just accept Brazilian invasion, the landowners' invasion in Uruguay. So how they would defend their landowners at the same time that they would respect the international laws was a real crossroad. How they could forget the fact that the ones who wanted to invade Uruguay to get their slaves back were the ones who wanted to separate from the empire in 1835. While all that was happening in the everyday life of the ones living in the borders, of course, more and more people were seeking refuge in the Uruguayan borders. And at the same time, bandits, slave catchers were seeing this as a way in which they could make a lot of money. So they would invade themselves, not only with the landowners anymore, the borders. They would attack those black communities in Uruguay. They would kidnap everyone they could. They would bring to Brazil. They would fake documents saying that they were Brazilians and born into slavery in the churches of Jaguarão and Pelotas, and they would sell them in Rio Grande do Sul. In the 70 cases that I read about this, pretty much all of them dealt with mothers and children. They were really after very young children who would not have the memory of the enslavement, and the moms would come to, so they would make possible the crossing. I've seen 6 months old, I've seen 2 years old, 4 years old, 8 years old, all of them being separated in Brazil and all sold into slavery. When those cases started to be common, 1854, 55, 56, they were called by the Uruguayan consul was once a new way of trafficking, and the Uruguayans start to complain with the Brazilian government, with the Brazilian consul, with the British in Rio, with the British in Britain, and the British consul in Porto Alegre would write monthly reports to the British representative in Rio only about the slave trade, saying there is a big movement of people that are seeking the borders just to enslave others and bring to Brazil. And it reached a point in 1860 or more when an Uruguayan deputy said, once complaining to, he said, the language, the habits, everything in the north of Uruguay is Brazilian. We are a continuation of Rio Grande do Sul. Brazil would answer with those complaints, saying that they really were trying to keep those criminals and convict them. And they were, this is in part true, because you can see that there were lawsuits against illegal enslavement in Brazil. But this is only a partial truth, because even though they were really trying to catch some of the enslavers and return some of the Uruguayans that were kidnapped, no one, as far as I know, was ever convicted of the crime of illegal enslavement in the borders. So they would start a lawsuit, but at the end, being judged by the good citizens of each town, no one was ever convicted. And the reasons why were the most crazy ones for someone reading in the 21st century. They would say, oh, I didn't know that I had crossed the border, actually. Oh, I didn't know that slavery in Uruguay was abolished. Or I didn't know that this person was from Uruguay. And then they ask, but you didn't see that that person doesn't speak Portuguese, no Spanish? Oh, really? I didn't notice. You read this in the documents, and you can't believe that they buy those reasons, and no one is convicted of the crime of illegal enslavement. So where does this lead us? In the years that followed, in the early 1860s, there was an increasing tension over the borders that would come from those complaints, would come from attacks of Brazilian property in Uruguay, that would come from a beginning of a new civil war in the borders when Venancio Flores, the Colorado, attacked from Argentina, attacked Uruguay, trying to win the presidency over the Blancos. And the situation grew so bad that in 1863, an old leader of the Farroupilha movement, General Neto, went all the way from the border of Rio Grande do Sul to Rio to have a secret meeting with the Emperor, Dom Pedro II, that you don't know exactly what they say because there is no documents, but people would talk about that in the House of Representatives later, basically saying that if the national government of Rio Grande do Sul didn't help them to solve those tensions in the borders, to recover that property, they would join the Colorados and they would separate from Brazil again. That happened in a very bad movement for Brazilian politics when the liberals took over from the first time after almost 20 years the government from the conservatives. So they had to show that they were as tough as the conservadores in Brazil, and they knew how to negotiate with Uruguay. So what they did, they sent Saraiva to Montevideo. As we know, when Saraiva arrived there, the diplomatic relations were already very, very torn. As we know now, that Pacific mission was followed by the warships and the troops. And even though Saraiva tried to negotiate, he gave to the Uruguayans copies of the Brazilian complaints for all those past years, saying that Brazilian property was attacked and so on. Herrera, which was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay, he answered. It's a very ironic answer, actually, saying that he didn't really understand the reasons for Brazilians' complaints. Because, first of all, It seems that there were 40,000 Brazilians living in Uruguay then. Why they didn't move back? And he would say that the real reasons for Brazil to complain against Uruguay were not to defend the Brazilians who actually lived in Uruguay, but to defend the Brazilians that lived in the Brazilian borders, who were pirates of the border, I'm quoting there, barbarians, caudillos, that would even attack the Brazilians that lived in Uruguay in order to get slaves and cattle back. At the end of his letter, Herrera attached the Uruguayans' complaints. 48 complaints in the past 10 years, none answered by Brazil. This is the book. Out of 48 official complaints, at least 33 dealt directly with enslavement of free women and children, and the others had some relationship to the freed communities in the north. They printed those complaints in a book, which was translated in Portuguese, English, French, and Italian. Saraiva was super offended with Herrera's answer, wrote a confidential letter to the government in Rio, saying that he was surprised, and I'm quoting too, with the lack of finesse from the Uruguayans that brought irrational complaints against the empire. And then he says, it's urgent to organize and distribute our troops in the border. The end of the story is known. After negotiating the alliance with the Colorados and the Argentinians, he leaves to Brazil. 3 months later, Brazil invades northern Uruguay. It's interesting because I think from this we can understand, first of all, he never sent to Rio the complaints. He never negotiated with Herrera the complaints. He just took the complaints as something that was really, really offensive to Brazil and returned home. So I think that with this rather long explanation, I think we can understand why Brazil invaded Uruguay. And here is the map of the first invasion, which is that from Pirai Grande to Melo. Of course, this is not the only cause of the war. I'm not, again, trying to make such an argument. But the Brazilian attack made the Paraguay, which was allied with the Uruguayan Blancos, to become fearful of a possible super powerful alliance between Brazil, Colorados, and Argentinians. Paraguay threatened Brazil, saying that if they attacked Uruguay, they would interrupt the Brazilian passage over the Paraguayan River. I think the Brazilians never really believed that they would do that, but they did. And in many ways, we can say that the Paraguayans reacted to this Brazilian action. So the war started in October 16, 1864, and those 2 months made this huge difference. So now the second question that I was thinking about when I started saying that is that where is all this story? Why this is not part of what we read as the causes of the Paraguayan War, or why the Brazilian invasion to Uruguay is not part of the official story of the Paraguayan War. So here, I'm sharing with you some thoughts. First of all, one of the Saraiva assistants, years later, he referred to the Uruguayan complaints as a true provocation. I think one of the things that Saraiva really wanted, and for several years after that, was defend himself from the accusation that he was responsible for the outcome of the war. You see those accusations well into the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. After the end of the Brazilian Empire, not just Saraiva, but all the monarchist politicians, were, including Joaquim Nabuco, who was one important abolitionist, were trying to write a narrative of the Brazilian Empire as a country that would defend the principles of international law, freedom, and civilization. It's not by coincidence that even now some historians still portray the Emperor Dom Pedro II as a defender of civilization, the arts, the sciences, and freedom. In order to do that, for Saraiva to create an idea that he wasn't responsible for the war, it was important to settle 2 points. First, that his diplomatic mission was successful because of the establishment of the alliance. Second, that both the Blancos in Uruguay and the Paraguayans were not reasonable in their actions, while Brazilians were very, very reasonable. So I think we can understand that, but at the same time, why the historiography bought this version for such a long time? Now again, in the plan of the hypothesis, I think that I'm a social historian, and most social historians look at this kind of source that I'm looking at, lawsuits and documents that could reveal the action of the common people. Most of us would not look at the main political history, and those accounts of the war are the typical political history documents. Most political historians also don't look at the social documents. So one of the things that is happening now, it's because of the fact that those documents, the social history documents, lawsuits, and all kinds of little clues that make possible for us to reach the common people are being organized in the archives in the ways that are reachable. So it's really because not only the new interest, but because of the fact that we can now find documents that we couldn't before, and I even couldn't when I started this, we can see a new way of combining those documents in something that I think can be called the social history of international relations. I think the social history of international relations is important as the same way as a social history of the law was some years ago, and in the same way that we can renovate a history of the politics as it would have been done in the whole 20th century. That probably will make us look at the Brazilian international relations in 19th century from a different perspective. If we get a book on international relations in 19th century, they would say that Brazilian affairs were divided into 2 different branches. One with the British that dealt pretty much about slavery and ended in 1850 with a little thing in 1863, 1 and 3. Brazil started to look at Rio de la Plata after the slave trade was over and was free to be to have a big role in that area. What I think that we can think differently after we see that is that slavery actually connects both branches, and we need to look at them connectedly and not separately as they have been. If we don't do it, we are running the risk of missing a huge part of this politics, which is the fact that they wanted to defend slavery at any cost. And now it's the first thing, the last piece. When I was finishing this and trying to write about it, I was reading a romance, a mystery novel actually, written by a Brazilian author called Musa. And it's an interesting novel because he tells the crime right in the beginning. He's not saying that he's telling the crime, but you are reading it and you are like, I mean, it's not possible that the crime is not the way he described. So what's the mystery? And the clue that he leaves in the book, and he repeats in many ways, and he finishes the book with, so I'm not telling you the title so you can read, is that o que não é segredo não se pode descobrir. If something is not a secret, it can't be discovered. And he repeats that. So I kept this in my mind. And I was thinking, yes, slavery is a secret in that society, is a non-secret that can't be discovered. All those documents who didn't refer related to slavery were really talking about slavery. When Saraiva was so hurt that the Uruguayans mentioned the illegal enslavement in a document translated into many languages, it's because even though they were discussing that in secret meetings, even though in the little towns those criminals were all known, this is something that people don't talk about because it's something that the Brazilians would keep, but they would never acknowledge. So I think that's the end of that story, which in some ways I think that it makes possible for us to unfold that story. But if we think about the consequences of that nowadays, I think we still need to think about that. Slavery, when it was abolished, still became the secret that no one talks about. Race is still a very, very big question, problem, issue in Brazil that only now is being talked about because no one liked to talk about it. And probably that's why, for so many years, we bought this idea that Brazil was a racial democracy, when has never been. So with that, I finish. Thank you.
That talk was incredible. It was great. I learned so much. I'm baffled by how little I know about Uruguay, clearly. I wanted to ask about, you started with the Dred Scott case, and of course that's such a important case in U.S. history. And I think part of it is that it gets spoken about a lot in terms of enslaved people's agency, right? And I thought that that's where this talk was going at the beginning, right? When you talked about passing through that town, et cetera. But it wasn't, and we don't really hear a lot about what Black people were doing. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know what they were doing. What was their status in Uruguay? Ostensibly, some of them were previously enslaved Brazilian people. What was their relation with the border, and et cetera?
Well, thanks so much. This is actually the piece that I couldn't fit in the talk, but we actually know that the main ones who were, of course, not just resisting enslavement, but providing the consuls and other authorities, the police, with information, were the ones that were enslaved and were trying to, the moms trying to find their children, etc. So my main case, and I've been in those 70 lawsuits, I'm following 5 specifically because this is the same group of people that were enslaving lots of people. So just to give you an example, Rufina was an African woman that was actually illegally enslaved twice. Because she was from Africa, and from the date and from her age that we can sort of calculate, she was brought to either Uruguay or Brazil by the time that slave trade was already prohibited then. She lived in one of those neighboring communities in the border. She was freed because of the abolition of slavery in 1842, because her master was a general from Montevideo, not someone from the Blanco side. She knew her, but it's interesting just to tell how unstable things were. Even though she was freed because of the abolition of slavery, she had a letter of manumission. So it shows how complicated that was. Anyway, she was kidnapped with 4 of her 6 children. And her, I mean, we say husband, which was African too. He disappears, and I didn't find him anymore. So I think he was killed in the way to Brazil. She's taken to Brazil, separated from 2 of those 4. The one who has 6 and 8, the ones who had 6 and 8 years old. Those were sold to another place. She was being taken to a town called São Leopoldo, which is right in the north of Porto Alegre. And I don't know how, but she managed to be arrested with her enslaver and the 2 kids and be sent to prison. And when she's there, then she tells her story. I'm saying all that because that's what they are doing all the time. They are telling their stories. And they are telling their stories in such a consistent way that no one ever doubts that they were telling the truth. When she said, my manumission letter is in the house of my neighbor, which is another interesting sign of the fear of kidnapping. He's keeping my letter, blah, 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 blah. You can go there and check. No one goes. They all believe in her story. Which is amazing is that her enslaver is he calls himself a master, Laurindo José da Costa. He says that he can also prove that he owns them, but the documents were home. So if he could just go home and get the documents and return, he would prove that he owns them. He never comes back, of course. But they knew that, because when he kidnapped her and when he was arrested, he had already been arrested 3 times before by the same people. So that's the secret that everyone knows. But some people who would help enslaved individuals to cross the border to Uruguay and receive payment, like so many movies we saw on the Holocaust, that people would get money to help people cross the borders, would be the ones who would kidnap some and bring them to be sold into slavery. So it's hard because it's a story that you find, oh, here are the good guys. But they are not the good guys because they are doing both things. Anyway, but those stories are absolutely told. They knew they were freed. They crossed the borders knowing that they would be freed in Uruguay and Argentina, and even though that doesn't guarantee much, was much better than staying into slavery in Brazil. So, as far as I know now, this is really a story of resistance and being told basically by women. So when Rufina tells her story, they call her daughter, 14-year-old daughter, to tell her story. And she's not with Rufina when she's being interrogated. And she tells the same story. And and Rufina comes with a 6-month-old baby. That was probably the one who was, one of the ones who were really the target. So those are the people. And there are many pieces that I don't know yet, especially the relationship with the consuls in the Uruguayan side. There were not that many. There are not that many people to work in the bureaucracy and to supervise the borders. So how exactly this is being told is something that it's still unclear, but I'm sure that they were absolutely aware of what was going on and trying to defend themselves. Just another piece about that. There is an episode of 2 Uruguayans that were sold into slavery, and they were being sent to the Paraíba Valley between Rio and São Paulo. When they arrive in Rio by ship, they manage to escape, and they find the home of Lamas, which was the Uruguayan representative there. And they tell the story and they say, we've been illegally enslaved, blah, 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 we've been brought to Rio, and we want to be sent back. So, so this is really where the real people are in that story.
And can I just follow up really quickly? So what happens to somebody like Rufina after
she's sent back?
She's sent back to her.
Oh, so the end of that story?
Yes, please.
Is she's sent back. Oh, it's actually much more like Hollywoodian than that.
Please talk forever. Just go on.
No, yeah. Except that you should promise that we will see the movie when it comes out. No.
Yeah.
So when they know that story, when she sent the story, she's kept in prison, and Laurindo, the enslaver, is off. You read the trial. If you just read the lawsuit, you see that at some point she's sent back to Uruguay. But that's not that's not just that. What happens is that while she's being imprisoned, after she was kidnapped, the two other, I don't know how old they were, kids talk to the older people in this black community. They talk somehow to the authorities that write letters to the Uruguayan consul in Rio, who talk to the British consul in Rio, who talks to the British Minister of Affairs in England, who writes to the Brazilian Minister of Affairs, this is all in 3 months, in Rio, who writes to the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, asking, I've heard that a person named Rufina was kidnapped. Where is she? Where she was? She happened to be at the prison, right in the same building where the presidential palace was. So what the governor says, she's here. That's why we are working against illegal slave trade. But it was a coincidence, because she was in prison before the letter arrived. So anyway, he says, we are fighting illegal slave trade, and we're going to find the kids, the other kids. They did. They called the journalists. They reunite them, Rufina and her 4 children, and she's sent back to the place she was. And you know that because there are some, it's like accounts of the persons that were with her. They say she was given to someone. They took the ship Fluminense. They crossed the border. Blah blah blah. So you see her steps. So she's sent back. It's a happy ending. But what happens is, as the lawsuit follows, then you see the enslavers back, because the prosecutor, the role of the prosecutors is really interesting. The local prosecutors are really trying to catch some people. So he writes this huge letter saying that this is a criminal, that he already enslaved lots of people, that he had other ones working with him, and write their names. And then the trials goes on and on and on. And when this is a crime, the illegal enslavement is a crime by the Criminal Code of Brazil. It has to be judged by a jury, not by a judge. So when the jury is formed, 12 people, 11, I have the name of the 12, 11 vote for the, how do you say that? Not the conviction, the opposite? Acquittal. 1 says that he's guilty. I don't know who he is, the person that voted that he's guilty, because I have the names. You know 12 Men and a Secret, the movie? I have the names, but I don't have the individual votes. So I'm going to guess. And I'm going to say that when I write it, that even though I'm not sure, I'll try to get information from them. But I think that, frankly, I think that this has nothing to do with slavery. I think that it's probably someone who doesn't like that guy for some other reasons. Not that he's not, I don't want to be romantic about that. Not that I found someone that really is against that. Because when both lawyers come up with names, the names have to be approved by both sides. So, so that's the that's the end of the story.
Right.
This is really asking a lot. You know, this is so complicated just to get us to the beginning of the Paraguayan War. So to ask you to also talk about the impact of the Paraguayan War. But I guess the quandary I have is that on the one hand, you make it very convincing that they're defending slavery at all cost. Although the question is also who exactly, you know. But we also know that the Paraguayan War undoes slavery in Brazil, at least as a permanent institution, and that soon after the end of the war, the free womb law, with all its limitations, is passed. So they're fighting at all costs, but they're also ultimately moving toward abolition. So I guess my question is this a function of the war itself? That is, can we just say that the move to abolition is part of the process of the Paraguayan War, or are there tendencies before the war that help us understand that, you know, 6 years later they start to, yeah.
I can think about two things that can sort of explain that. One is the fact that the war happening at the same time as the Civil War and abolition of slavery in the U.S. made a huge impact at the point that they started actually talking about the free womb law in 1866, even though they was just passed in 71. And 66, 67 were really crucial years about ending of slavery. There is something else that I think that we don't know much about, but we need to analyze better, is the fact that the liberals who were in power in the beginning of the war from 1861 to 64 were replaced by the conservatives during the war. And the free womb law is a work by the conservatives. Not, of course, not because they were for abolition, but to, in some ways, to try to control the process, which seemed to be they seem to be losing control over the years in the late 1860s. So I think of that those things together made them realize not that they would abolish slavery, but they would have to control this process in a better way. Otherwise, they would either lose, or a civil war like the U.S. Civil War could happen there, which, I mean, it's a hypothesis.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was so fascinating. So I want to find out more about everything, but I'll just focus on one thing, which is the kidnapping, or kidnapping in general. I guess I'm curious to know if you see it as a kind of local border phenomenon, or is it a bigger policy that's seen in a sense as an alternative to the transatlantic slave trade after 1850? And is that why they're kidnapping children as a guarantee against ultimate? So if you could talk more about just how that came to be, are there discussions about it as policy? Who does it? How does it work as a system, etc.?
It's so interesting because when I was reading Miller's book Joe Miller's book on Angola, and all the description of enslavement, and then also the works that followed on that, he calls that a frontier of enslavement as a concept for the expansion of the Angolan state, the Angolan colony. And I'm calling this a new border of enslavement, or a new frontier of enslavement, referring directly to Miller's work, because I think that's exactly the same thing that is happening. It is a transnational, or no, transatlantic movement, in the sense that targets were kids or children. If Rufina was enslaved in West, she calls herself Mina, and that's the only thing we know about her African origins, as being from West Africa. when you look at the records, in West Africa, probably in the 1820s when she was probably enslaved, a, uh, at least 70% of the slave trade was composed by what we would call today children and teenagers, up to 14 years old, as you know. So it's the movement. It's exactly the same. I don't think they were, or of course, organizing it in that way, but for sure they were. They had an experience, even by doing themselves, or by seeing the enslavement of children. And we can't also forget that during the whole 1850s, slave ships were still trying to come to Brazil, and they were going to Cuba, basically with children. And there's something else that I didn't even address, which is the illegal enslavement of free blacks and indigenous people inside Brazil. Inside Brazil. Because those cases are the ones that we know about because of the border crossing. And the only ones we know about are the ones that the ones who were kidnapped managed to reach the authorities somehow. I think that for 70, there are probably 7,000 of people being kidnapped and being enslaved. And if you think within the borders of some cases that we see in Pernambuco, Bahia, Rio Grande do Sul, everywhere, free people were being enslaved all the time because of the ending of the Atlantic slave trade. The price of those enslaved individuals was extremely high. Going back, if you think of the price going back to when the prices were really high in the 18th century, then the price went down. So they were a huge commodity, and I really think we should look at those cases not in a local perspective, but in this transnational, transatlantic perspective. And I also I also think that even though those cases seem local, the passage of people in that border was had much more people involved than in other borders of Brazil. But other Brazilian historians like Flávio Gomes, he's looking at the Amazonian border with Venezuela, and he's finding some cases. There's people finding cases in Colombia. There's people finding cases in Bolivia. I found many references that I couldn't check yet on Peru. The fact that Brazil signed a treaty about extradition of slaves with Peru, which is, it's hard for me to even think how they could cross the Andes. So how, how, or if they would be taken by ship, I don't know. So, and and it has, I think, a lot of resonance in the works that you, Rebecca Scott, Jean Brar are doing in the Caribbean, in the ways in which people were seeking refuge. They knew about their condition would change. And I think that's something really important for me is the definition of what we can call the slave territoriality and the free territoriality, and the fact that just crossing the border, your status will change dramatically. And if you change and go back and change, and that would all the time change your status and your chances to live as a free person. So quite a long answer, but that's
Going to the point that her asked you, I was thinking about the case that you explained was a case that you have problems between Uruguay and Brazil, but was Rufina, as you said, was a happy end in this case. I was thinking, yeah, I was thinking that maybe when the guys that work in the Californians uh, thing, when they were put in jail in Uruguay, what happened? They could be persecuted over there, or the Brazilian government asked them to go back to Brazil. How would happen when it's the opposite?
That's interesting, because illegal enslavement it wasn't a crime in the same way in Uruguay as it was in Brazil. It's just the slave trade had ended, but it didn't become an internal crime as it became in Brazil. So I don't know. Maybe it generated some lawsuits that are under um, different names, but they are not the same kind of lawsuit, as far as I know, that the ones that we see in Brazil.
Well,
So
couldn't it be kidnapping?
could be kidnapped. It could be just invasion. Could be robbery. But it's interesting because instead of filing a lawsuit against their them personally, what I found is that they would complain against the Brazilian authorities. So that I find. No, they're back. They go and they're back. And then you see all those complaints by the Uruguayans. They're stealing cattle, they're killing people, etc., etc. So, I mean, criminals.
I wanted to follow up on your discussion of public secrets and what you do with that and how you integrate that into thinking about a social history of international relations. And because listening, I mean, we're talking about something very, very serious, and we're talking about the border as this kind of real serious entity to be worked with. But I was thinking about the expression para inglés ver, right? And the creation of publics, and sort of how that might be integrated into this, because that whether or not you have moments when either, say, a slaver who's arrested or an formerly enslaved person pulls back that veil. Do you see that? Do you see certain moments of kind of almost even joking, wry recognition that we are the people who are subject to this secret, and we can admit it to certain groups, and in that manner creating certain types of communities. So it's not so much a social history of international relations in terms of legal maneuverings and diplomacy, but in terms of creation of publics. Do you have any documentary sources to see that moment of rolling back the public secret?
Well, I think your comment is very interesting. I have this like the legal discussion, especially over the treaties, and in something that I didn't touch today, but whether the Brazilian presence in Uruguay was a matter of extraterritoriality of the Brazilian laws that would be valid into Uruguay, which was basically, for our discussion, the fact that if they would be able to keep slavery in another country, if the Brazilian laws would be valid there. So there is a piece that is really, I think, diplomatic and international discussion from within. But your comment made me think about probably the main occasion in which they were creating the public, building an interpretation, and making fun of the British, which is in 1863 when the Brazilians cut relations with the British. This was for the second time because the first time was in the context of the abolition of the slave trade. And the reason for 1863 is something that 61, sorry, that people joke about all the time, which is called the Christie Question, a questão Christie, that started when a ship arrived, not by coincidence, in Rio Grande do Sul, and Vereker, the consul of the British in Porto Alegre, was following this very closely, saying that there was a risk of this ship to be a slave ship. He writes to Christie, which is the British ambassador in Rio. Christie is reporting all the attempts for the slave trade that were happening in the 1850s. And both of them, Vereker was, I think he was Christie's best consul because he provided lots of details. And all that were sent to as you know, to England. But all that case is not known by the Brazilian newspapers or anything, but by a book wrote by Christie many years later called The Brazil Question. So you don't know about that. That's the secret that they are talking about. So why Brazil cut relations with the British? Which is what we read in the papers, what people talk about, and till now it's written in the Brazilian textbooks. It's because when the ship, which was not a slave ship, arrived, two British drunk that were drunk were taken to prison by the Brazilian police. They didn't release them. Then the British said that they should be released, but they committed some minor crime, and the Brazilians said that they would never release them. Anyway, that, the Christie Question, is the official reason why Brazil and the British cut relations for 3 years. That's so I think that, and you open a textbook, you see that. Till now, they make fun of the British. This thing for the British to see, it started earlier in 1831, but it seems as if they were making fun of the British till then. But this was just for that public and for people who would buy that version. So.
Isn't there also the aspect that they are outraged, the British supposedly are outraged because the drunk British sailors are arrested by Brazilian policemen who are not white? So
Yeah, even though I never really saw the reference to the, probably they were not, as everyone, but there was this thing of they being very, very hurt by the fact of how they were arrested and why. But it's interesting, not that many years before that, in exactly the same, in the same beach, a slave ship was seen. It didn't get to the shore, but was seen and was reported by Vereker. This was 1856 or 7. 2 years before 1855, there was the last huge disembarkation in Pernambuco, in which the 200 Africans got to Pernambuco, disappeared into slavery there. And this is the known. There was one attempt in 1856 too, but after 55, there was really a change in the British-Brazilian relations. So, but this is all a kind of story that it's being known very recently because of the documents we're reading. The public doesn't know that in the 19th century and from then on.
Well, I think it's a good moment to go out and continue the conversation with the wine. So we invite you to the reception. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for a fascinating talk.
Thanks, Plata.
Thank you.